handwriting analysis, Patsy Ramsey, and the ransom note. We've examined the note's length and what investment reveals about stakes, traced through windows that stayed closed, and risks that compounded beyond reason. And now we need to turn our attention to something that sits at the intersection of science and interpretation, something that should have provided clarity, but instead became another layer of complexity in a case already thick with contradictions. We need to think about handwriting, about the marks made by a hand holding a pen, about what those marks reveal and conceal, about the uncomfortable reality that sits beneath expert disagreement. Because here's what whispers from the divergence of opinions, from the careful qualifications, and the confident assertions that somehow both exist in the same evidentiary space. When multiple experts examine the same handwriting samples and reach different conclusions about whether Patsy Ramsey could be excluded as the author of that ransom note, we're not looking at science producing clarity. We're looking at interpretation producing what it has always produced in this case: gaps, ambiguities, spaces where certainty should exist but doesn't. Let's establish what we're examining before we begin to navigate the interpretive landscape. Handwriting analysis, when done properly, examines multiple characteristics: letter formation patterns, spacing and proportion, pen pressure, slant consistency, baseline alignment, connecting strokes between letters, and the subtle individual variations that make each person's writing unique. From a forensic perspective, these characteristics operate at different levels of consciousness. Some are deliberate, the general style we were taught in school, the conscious choices about printing versus cursive. But others are unconscious, the slight tremor in certain letters, the way pressure varies through a stroke, the micro-movements that emerge from years of writing habit, encoded so deeply in motor patterns that we couldn't change them consciously even if we tried. And it's in these unconscious patterns that handwriting analysis finds its strongest foundation, because these are the elements hardest to disguise, the markers that persist even when someone attempts to alter their writing. Theme 1: The architecture of divergence. When experts cannot agree. When we look at the history of handwriting analysis in this case, we find something troubling that sits beneath the surface of confident public statements. Multiple experts examined the ransom note. Multiple experts compared it against Patsy Ramsey's known writing samples. And these experts, qualified, experienced professionals in document examination, reached different conclusions. From a logical perspective, if handwriting analysis were purely objective science, if the markers being examined were unambiguous, we would expect convergence rather than divergence. The fact that we have divergence, that some experts found similarities while others claimed definitive exclusion, tells us something important about the nature of what's being analyzed. We're not in the realm of pure objectivity. We're in the realm of interpretation, where expertise matters, but where the inherent ambiguity of the evidence allows for good faith disagreement. Let's think about what the disagreement actually consisted of. Some experts noted similarities in specific letter formations, the way certain characters were constructed, the patterns of connecting strokes, elements that appeared to match between Patsy's known writing and the ransom note. Other experts focused on differences, variations in slant, changes in letter size, elements that they interpreted as evidence the same hand could not have produced both documents. From a criminological perspective, this divergence isn't necessarily surprising. Handwriting exists on a spectrum of variation even within a single individual's writing. Stress affects pen pressure and letter formation. The act of attempting to disguise one's writing creates its own patterns. Writing quickly versus writing carefully produces different characteristics. So, when we're comparing samples, we're never looking for perfect identity. We're looking for patterns of similarity that exceed what we would expect from chance, or patterns of difference that definitively exclude common authorship. And here's where interpretation enters. At what point do similarities become convincing? At what point do differences become exclusionary? These are judgment calls, not mathematical certainties. From a psychological perspective, we need to think about what motivated attempts at disguise would look like versus what they wouldn't look like. If someone wanted to alter their handwriting to avoid identification, they would focus on the most obvious characteristics, changing slant, altering letter size, perhaps switching between printing and cursive, or modifying the most distinctive letters. They know they typically form in unusual ways, but the unconscious elements, the subtle pressure variations, the micro movements, the deeply ingrained motor patterns, these are far harder to consciously modify. They persist even through attempts at disguise, emerging in the patterns that experts who found similarities were pointing to. So the presence of both similarities and differences in handwriting could actually be evidence not of different authors, but of one author attempting to disguise their writing while unable to fully suppress the unconscious markers that years of writing habit had encoded into their motor patterns. Now, let's consider what the specific similarities that were noted actually consisted of. Some experts pointed to the formation of specific letters, the way certain characters began and ended, the particular loops or angles that appeared in both the note and Patsy's known writing. They noted patterns in how letters were connected, how spacing was managed, how certain combinations of letters were consistently formed in ways that matched between samples. From a physiological standpoint, these formation patterns emerge from the motor sequences our brains encode through repetition. When we write a letter, we're executing a motor program, a sequence of muscle movements that has been practiced so many times, it becomes automatic. And these motor programs are remarkably stable across different writing contexts, persistent even when we're trying to change other aspects of our writing. The experts who found similarities were, in essence, saying, we see motor patterns in the ransom note that match motor patterns in Patsy's known writing, and those patterns are specific enough, unusual enough, that their presence in both documents is difficult to explain by chance. Let's shift to what the experts who claimed exclusion were focusing on. They pointed to overall appearance. The note looked different from Patsy's normal writing in gross characteristics, like slant and size. They noted what appeared to be deliberate alterations, conscious choices to form letters differently than the comparison samples showed. From a logical standpoint, these observations aren't wrong. There are differences. But the question is what those differences mean. Do they mean different authors? Or do they mean the same author writing under different circumstances with different intentions? attempting to create distance between their normal writing and what was being produced for the note. The experts who excluded Patsy were essentially saying the differences we see are too substantial to be explained by normal variation or attempted disguise. But other experts looking at the same evidence reached the opposite conclusion. The differences look like exactly what we would expect if someone was attempting to disguise their writing while unable to fully suppress unconscious patterns. From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that handwriting analysis as a forensic discipline exists in a somewhat liminal space. It has scientific elements, but it also has interpretive elements that make it less definitive than, say, DNA analysis. Different cultures and different legal systems treat handwriting evidence with different levels of confidence. In some contexts, it's considered highly reliable. In others, it's viewed with more skepticism precisely because of the interpretive element we're discussing. The divergence of expert opinion in this case reflects this broader reality about the discipline. When evidence is genuinely ambiguous, when there are elements pointing in both directions, expert opinion will diverge not because anyone is incompetent or dishonest, but because the evidence itself exists in that interpretive space where reasonable experts can disagree. From a philosophical perspective, we need to think about what certainty means in this context and what its absence reveals. The experts who claimed definitive exclusion of Patsy were asserting a level of certainty that, given the divergence of opinion, the evidence may not actually support. From a logical standpoint, when multiple qualified experts examining the same evidence reach different conclusions, that divergence itself tells us the evidence isn't definitive. It tells us we're in ambiguous territory, where certainty should give way to probability, where definitive statements should be replaced with acknowledgement of the interpretive element. And that ambiguity, that lack of definitive exclusion, becomes itself significant in a case where so much depends on whether the note could have been written by someone in that house or had to have been written by someone external to it. So when we step back and consider the architecture of divergence, qualified experts reaching different conclusions, some seeing similarities while others claim exclusion, the evidence supporting multiple interpretations depending on what weight is given to similarities versus differences, we're looking at something that refuses to provide the clarity we might wish for. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the divergence tells us that Patsy Ramsey was not definitively excluded as the author of that note. That doesn't mean she definitely wrote it, but it means the handwriting evidence doesn't eliminate the possibility, doesn't provide the clean exclusion that would allow us to look confidently outward rather than uncomfortably inward. The divergence of expert opinion becomes one more gap, one more space where certainty should exist but doesn't, one more thread in the pattern of ambiguities that characterize every aspect of this case. And perhaps what's most revealing is what happened to that ambiguity in public discourse, how confident assertions of exclusion became the story, while the quieter voices noting similarities, the careful qualifications about the interpretive nature of the analysis, these got lost in the need for a clean narrative that provided comfort rather than confronting uncomfortable possibilities. Theme 2. the patterns that persist, what unconscious markers reveal. We've established that experts disagreed, and now we need to look more closely at what some of those experts were actually seeing when they noted similarities. Because it's not enough to say there was divergence, we need to understand what specific elements were matching, what patterns appeared in both the ransom note and Patsy's known writing that caused some experts to pause, to question, to conclude that exclusion wasn't as certain as others claimed. From a forensic perspective, these specific similarities matter more than general impressions because they represent the unconscious markers we discussed, the motor patterns that persist even through attempts at disguise. Let's examine what was actually being pointed to and why those pointings refused to disappear despite confident claims of exclusion. One element that multiple analysts noted was the formation of specific letters. The lowercase a appeared in both samples with a particular construction, not the way most people form that letter, but a specific variant that appeared consistently in both the note and Patsy's known writing. The way certain letters terminated, the particular angles at which strokes ended, the patterns of whether letters were connected or separated in certain combinations. These micro-level characteristics showed matches that exceeded what probability alone would predict. From a physiological standpoint, these formation patterns are precisely the kind of unconscious markers that are difficult to alter. When our hand writes a letter, it's executing a motor program encoded through thousands of repetitions. Consciously changing the overall appearance of writing is relatively easy. Consciously changing these micro-level motor patterns is far more difficult because they operate below the level where we typically monitor our movements. Let's think about pen pressure and what it reveals. Some experts noted patterns in how pressure varied through certain letter formations, where the pen pressed harder, where it lifted slightly. The rhythm of pressure changes as the hand moved through a word. These pressure patterns are almost entirely unconscious. We don't think about where to apply pressure when we write. Our motor system manages this automatically based on the mechanics of letter formation and our individual writing habits. And yet, analysts noted pressure patterns in the ransom note that matched pressure patterns in Patsy's known writing. From a psychological perspective, this is exactly what we would expect if someone was attempting to disguise their writing. They would focus conscious attention on visible elements like slant and letter size, while the unconscious elements like pressure variation would continue following their established patterns, emerging as a kind of signature that persists despite attempts at concealment. From a criminological standpoint, we need to think about what attempting to disguise handwriting actually involves cognitively. It requires sustained conscious attention to every letter, constant monitoring to ensure the alterations are being maintained. And here's what research on disguised handwriting shows. The longer someone writes while attempting disguise, the more their natural patterns begin to emerge. Early in a document, disguise might be well maintained, but as cognitive load increases, as attention wavers, the natural motor patterns begin to reassert themselves. Some analysts noted exactly this pattern in the ransom note, elements that appeared more disguised early in the document, but places where the writing seemed to relax back toward more natural patterns as the note progressed. This kind of progression where disguise weakens over the course of a long document, is precisely what we would expect if someone was attempting to alter their writing while producing the lengthy ransom note we've been examining. Now let's consider the spacing and proportion patterns that were noted. The way words were spaced on the page, the proportions between different letters, the management of available space. These are elements that operate at a level of awareness somewhere between fully conscious and fully unconscious. We have some control over them, but much of how we manage space comes from established habit. Some experts noted that spacing patterns in the ransom note matched spacing patterns in Patsy's writing. The way lines were positioned relative to each other, the management of margins, the patterns of where words fell relative to available space. From an anthropological lens, these spatial management patterns reflect cultural learning, how we were taught to position writing on a page, combined with individual variations that develop through our personal writing history. The presence of similar spatial patterns in both documents suggests either the same author or a remarkable coincidence of spatial habits between two different writers. Let's shift to thinking about what the overall gestalt of the writing reveals. Beyond specific letter formations and pressure patterns, some experts noted that the ransom note and Patsy's known writing shared an overall quality, a kind of writing personality that transcends individual characteristics. From a psychological perspective, this gestalt emerges from the totality of habits, choices, and unconscious patterns that make up someone's writing style. It's harder to quantify than specific letter matches, more subject to interpretive judgment, but experienced document examiners often speak of recognizing this quality, this sense that two documents share a common author even when specific characteristics might vary. The experts who saw similarities were, in part, responding to this gestalt, a sense that the ransom note felt like Patsy's writing even where specific elements might have been altered. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask what level of similarity is meaningful. If we see 5 matching characteristics between two documents, does that suggest common authorship? 10, 20? At what point do coincidental similarities become improbable enough that common authorship becomes the simpler explanation? The experts who found similarities were implicitly arguing that the level and specificity of matches they observed exceeded what chance would produce, that the simpler explanation for the pattern of similarities was common authorship despite surface differences. The experts who claimed exclusion were implicitly arguing that the differences outweighed the similarities, that the variations they observed were too substantial to be explained by disguise or contextual factors. Both positions involve judgment calls about how to weigh evidence, and the divergence reflects genuine ambiguity in that weighting rather than one group being obviously right and the other obviously wrong. So when we consider the patterns that persist, the specific letter formations, pressure variations, spacing habits, and overall gestalt that analysts noted as similarities between the ransom note and Patsy's known writing, we're looking at elements that refuse to allow clean exclusion. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, these persistent patterns suggest at minimum that Patsy could not be definitively eliminated as a possible author of that note. The patterns might be explained by remarkable coincidence, by someone who happened to share multiple unconscious writing habits with Patsy. Or they might be explained by what some experts concluded, that Patsy wrote the note while attempting to disguise her writing, successfully altering some characteristics while unable to fully suppress the unconscious patterns that years of writing had encoded into her motor memory. The evidence doesn't definitively prove either interpretation, but it absolutely refuses to eliminate the second possibility, refuses to provide the clean exclusion that would allow investigation to look only outward. And that refusal, that persistence of patterns that won't allow certainty, becomes one more thread in the tapestry of ambiguities that characterizes this case. Theme 3. The weight of what cannot be excluded. Living in interpretive space. We've examined expert divergence and persistent patterns, and now we need to confront what it means to exist in this interpretive space, what it means that Patsy Ramsey could not be definitively excluded as the author of that note, despite confident public assertions that she was. From a logical perspective, we're taught to think in terms of certainty. Either she wrote it or she didn't. Either the handwriting matches or it doesn't. But the reality of this evidence is more complex, more nuanced, existing in a space where certainty gives way to probability, where definitive answers are replaced by careful qualifications about what can and cannot be concluded. And in that space, uncomfortable, ambiguous, refusing resolution, sits a truth about this case that has never been fully acknowledged in public discourse. Let's think about what it means psychologically to be unable to exclude someone as the author of a document that, if they wrote it, fundamentally changes our understanding of what happened. If Patsy wrote that note, then everything about the intruder narrative collapses. The note becomes staging rather than genuine communication, evidence of family involvement rather than external action. From a criminological perspective, the note is the linchpin of the intruder theory. Without it, we're left with a child who is lost in her own home with no clear evidence of external entry or exit, no witnesses to an intruder, no forensic evidence that definitively points outward. So the question of who wrote that note isn't just an interesting detail. It's fundamental to understanding whether investigation should focus inward or outward. And the handwriting evidence, with its ambiguities and expert disagreements, refuses to provide the clear directional signal we might wish for. From a philosophical standpoint, we need to think about how public discourse handles ambiguity versus how investigation should handle it. Public discourse tends toward certainty, toward clear stories that provide resolution and don't require sitting with discomfort. So, when some experts claimed definitive exclusion of Patsy, that became the story that gained traction. Clean, clear, pointing investigation outward rather than creating the discomfort of looking at a mother as a possible author of a ransom note for her own child. But investigation shouldn't operate from comfort. Investigation should sit with ambiguity, should acknowledge when evidence doesn't provide certainty, should be willing to follow threads even when they lead to uncomfortable places. The handwriting evidence, properly understood, says, we cannot exclude Patsy. That doesn't mean she definitely wrote it, but it means that possibility cannot be eliminated based on the handwriting analysis, cannot be set aside as definitively disproven, and that failure to exclude, that persistence of possibility, should have shaped investigation differently than it apparently did. Now let's consider what attempted disguise would actually look like and whether the patterns we see are consistent with it. From a physiological perspective, someone attempting to disguise their handwriting would focus on the most obvious elements. They would change slant, alter letter size, perhaps modify the most distinctive letters they're aware of, forming unusually. But they would struggle to alter the unconscious patterns, the pressure variations, the micro movements, the deeply encoded motor programs. And this is exactly what some analysts claimed to see: surface alterations that created an appearance of different handwriting, but underlying patterns that matched Patsy's known writing. From a psychological standpoint, this pattern makes sense if we're thinking about someone under stress, someone attempting to create a disguised document but not having the time or cognitive resources to maintain perfect alteration throughout. The conscious disguise persists to some degree, but the unconscious patterns emerge despite intentions to suppress them. Let's think about what the circumstances of writing that note would have involved if Patsy was the author. From a criminological perspective, we're talking about someone writing under extreme psychological stress, processing what had happened, making impossible decisions about how to protect what remained of the family, attempting to create a document that would redirect investigation. In such circumstances, cognitive resources are stretched. The ability to maintain sustained conscious attention to disguising every aspect of writing would be impaired by stress, by competing demands on attention, by the overwhelming nature of what was being processed. Some slippage, some emergence of natural patterns despite attempts at disguise would be exactly what we would expect under such conditions. The fact that analysts saw both differences and similarities, both conscious alterations and persistent underlying patterns, is consistent with exactly this kind of stressed, partially successful attempt at disguise. From an anthropological lens, we can think about how families respond to internal crises and what that response looks like in terms of evidence creation. When something terrible happens within a family, and the decision is made to conceal rather than immediately disclose, staging occurs. And staging, by its nature, involves creating false evidence, evidence meant to point investigation away from truth. A ransom note written by a family member would be exactly this kind of staged evidence. And if that family member was a mother, someone whose handwriting would naturally be available for comparison, we would expect exactly what we see: an attempt to alter the writing sufficiently to avoid obvious identification, combined with persistence of unconscious patterns that analysts familiar with handwriting could potentially detect. The handwriting evidence, understood this way, isn't failing to provide clarity. It's providing exactly the kind of complex, ambiguous evidence we would expect from staged documentation created under stress by someone whose normal writing samples were available for comparison. From a logical, investigative perspective, we need to ask, what should the inability to definitively exclude Patsy have meant for the investigation? It should have meant treating the note with appropriate skepticism, understanding that it might be staging rather than genuine external Communication. It should have meant looking carefully at family dynamics, at who had the knowledge to write such a note, at who had motive to create staging rather than immediately report what had happened. It should have meant understanding that the note, far from being definitive evidence of an intruder, might actually be the strongest evidence that what occurred happened within the family. The failure to treat the handwriting ambiguity with appropriate investigative weight, the tendency to accept confident exclusions rather than sit with uncomfortable inability to exclude, represents a kind of confirmation bias, taking evidence that fits the more comfortable narrative and giving it more weight than it objectively deserves, while minimizing evidence that points toward uncomfortable possibilities. So, when we consider the weight of what cannot be excluded, the reality that Patsy Ramsey could not be definitively eliminated as the author of that ransom note, despite public narratives suggesting otherwise, we're confronting one more gap between what we were told and what the evidence actually supports. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the handwriting evidence refuses to provide the certainty that would allow comfortable exclusion of family involvement. It sits instead in interpretative space, ambiguous, supporting multiple readings depending on how weight is assigned to similarities versus differences. And that ambiguity, that failure to allow clean exclusion, becomes itself significant in a case where so much depends on understanding whether that note came from outside the family or from within it. The handwriting doesn't definitively answer that question, but it absolutely refuses to eliminate the possibility that the answer is one we would prefer not to face. That the note was written by someone who lived in that house, someone whose motor patterns and unconscious writing habits persisted despite conscious attempts at disguise, someone for whom creating that note wasn't criminal communication, but desperate family preservation. Staging meant to protect what remained after catastrophe. The evidence exists in interpretive space. But so does truth, sometimes, refusing the certainty we crave and leaving us instead with probabilities, patterns, and the uncomfortable acknowledgement that what we were told was definitively excluded might not have been excluded at all. We've walked through expert divergence and persistent patterns, examined what unconscious markers reveal and what it means to exist in interpretive space where definitive exclusion proves impossible. What emerges isn't certainty about who wrote that note. The evidence genuinely doesn't support that level of certainty in either direction. What emerges is recognition that Patsy Ramsey could not be definitively excluded despite public narratives suggesting she was, that the handwriting evidence exists in ambiguous territory where similarities and differences both appear, where expert judgment diverges, where comfortable certainty gives way to uncomfortable possibility. The patterns that persist despite surface alterations, the expert opinions that noted matches in unconscious markers, the failure of confident exclusions to achieve consensus, all of this sits quietly in the evidence, asking to be acknowledged, refusing to allow the clean narrative that investigation might have preferred. The handwriting doesn't prove family involvement, but it absolutely refuses to eliminate that possibility, refuses to provide the definitive exclusion that would allow investigation to look only outward. And that refusal, sitting in the interpretive space where so much of this case exists, becomes one more thread in the pattern of ambiguities that characterize every element of what happened that night. Gaps where certainty should exist but doesn't. Spaces where comfortable answers are replaced by uncomfortable questions. Evidence that whispers possibilities no one wanted to hear, but that refused, despite all efforts to silence them, to simply disappear.